Emily Carter did not scream. She did not throw anything, did not demand an explanation, did not give her husband the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She simply walked into her home office, drafted the divorce papers, and signed them. Then she set her wedding ring on the dining table next to those papers, pulled her suitcase to the front door, and stepped out into the rain. She had nothing left to say to Daniel Carter, the man who just hours earlier had told his friends she would never leave because she needed the life he gave her. When she reached the gate, a worn pickup truck slowed to a stop in front of her. The man who stepped out was not wealthy, not powerful, not anyone the city would notice. But the way he looked at her, steady, unsurprised, stopped her cold. "I figured you'd finally walk out," Jack Miller said. Emily stared at him, because the real question wasn't why he was there. It was how long he had been waiting. To understand why Emily Carter walked out into the rain that night, with nothing but a suitcase and a signed divorce decree, you have to understand what her life actually looked like. Not from the outside, but from the inside. From the outside, it looked like everything. A $20 million penthouse on the Upper East Side. A husband whose face appeared on the cover of business magazines twice in the same year. Invitations to galas, charity dinners, and closed-door investor meetings that most people in New York spent entire careers trying to get into. Emily Carter was the wife of Daniel Carter, CEO of Nexum Financial, one of the fastest-growing fintech conglomerates in the country, and that name alone opened every door in the city. But a door that opens for your husband's name is not the same as a door that opens for yours. Emily had graduated top of her class from Columbia Law. She had turned down 3 partnership offers before she was 30. She had a mind for contracts that most senior partners twice her age couldn't match, the kind of mind that could read 200 pages of merger documentation and find the one clause buried on page 163 that would unravel everything in court 3 years later. That was not a skill people talked about at dinner parties. It was not the kind of talent that got photographed, but it was the reason Nexum Financial had survived 4 regulatory investigations, 2 failed acquisitions, and a near-catastrophic data breach that could have wiped out the company's valuation overnight. None of that had Daniel Carter's name on it in any public record. All of it had Emily's fingerprints on it in every file. She had told herself for years that this was fine, that she preferred working behind the scenes, that a strong marriage was a partnership, not a competition, that what mattered was the outcome, not the credit. She had believed all of it, or had tried to, because the alternative, admitting that she had spent the best years of her legal career making another person look like a genius, was not something she was ready to sit with. That changed on a Tuesday evening in October. Emily had come home early from a client meeting that had been pushed back. The penthouse was supposed to be empty. She could hear Daniel's voice before she reached the living room, not the careful, measured voice he used in board meetings, but the looser version he reserved for his close friends, the version that came out after 2 glasses of scotch and no audience worth impressing. She stopped in the hallway. Through the half-open door, she could hear him clearly. "She's not going anywhere," Daniel was saying, his tone somewhere between amusement and certainty. "Emily's smart, but she's comfortable. She likes the life. You really think she's going to walk away from all of this and start over? Come on." There was laughter from the other side of the call. Then Daniel added, quieter but still audible, "She needs this more than she lets on." Emily stood in the hallway for a long moment. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She simply stood there and listened to the man she had married reduce 9 years of her life to a calculation about comfort and dependency, and deliver it with the easy confidence of someone who had never once questioned whether he might be wrong. She went to her home office, closed the door, and sat at her desk. She did not cry. What she felt was not grief. It was something closer to the sensation of a fog lifting slow, then all at once, leaving everything underneath it sharp and overexposed. She had known in the abstract that Daniel underestimated her. Most people in her professional life underestimated her in one way or another. It was something she had learned to work around rather than fight. But there is a difference between being underestimated by the world and being underestimated by the person who sleeps beside you. There is a difference between being overlooked and being counted on to stay because leaving would cost you too much. Daniel hadn't just missed who she was. He had built a quiet theory around it and bet on it. She opened her laptop and spent the next 2 hours drafting divorce papers. She was still sitting at her desk when she heard a door open down the hallway. Not the front door. The bedroom door, and then a second voice. A woman's voice. One she did not recognize low, and then quickly hushed. Emily closed the laptop. She stood up. She walked to the bedroom doorway and looked inside long enough to confirm what she already in that moment understood. Then she turned around, went back to her desk, and finished the divorce papers she had been drafting. She printed them, signed them at the bottom in her clean, precise handwriting, and carried them to the dining table. She packed one suitcase efficiently without hesitation, the way she packed for business trips, taking only what was hers before the marriage. She left the jewelry. She left the tailored coats. She took her laptop, her files, and the small framed photograph from her desk that had nothing to do with Daniel. Then she carried the suitcase to the front door, set it down, walked back to the dining table, and placed her wedding ring next to the divorce papers. She did not leave a note. The papers said everything. When she stepped outside, it was raining, the cold, persistent kind that soaks through a coat in minutes. The street was quiet. The gate to the building's private drive stood open, and Emily walked through it, pulling her suitcase behind her, and for the first time in 9 years, she had no plan. No meeting, no strategy waiting on the other side of the next hour. That was when the truck appeared. It was an older model, dark blue, practical, the kind of vehicle that had no business being parked on this block. It slowed and stopped directly in front of her, and the man who stepped out was not what this neighborhood expected at this hour. He was tall, somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a jacket that had seen better years. He looked at her the way very few people in Emily's life had ever looked at her, not at the coat, not at the address behind her, not at the suitcase with any trace of surprise. He looked at her as though he had been expecting exactly this. "I figured you'd finally walk out," Jack Miller said. Emily stared at him. She knew that face. It took her a second to place it outside of its original context, a shared conference room years ago, a contract negotiation that had run past midnight, a man who had been the only other person in the room who caught the same clause she caught before anyone else did. Jack Miller, software engineer turned tech consultant, the last she had heard. She had not seen him in years. "Jack," her voice was level. "What are you doing here?" Jack looked at the suitcase, then back at her face. He did not offer an explanation right away. Instead, he reached over and opened the passenger door, as though the answer to that question could wait until she was out of the rain. "I'll explain on the way," he said. "Where do you need to go?" Emily looked at him for a moment. She thought about the penthouse behind her, the papers on the table, the voice she had heard in the hallway saying she would never leave. She thought about the fact that she had no destination planned, and that for the first time in a very long time, that did not feel like a failure. It felt like the first honest thing that had happened to her in years. She picked up her suitcase and got in the truck. Jack pulled away from the curb without drama, merging into the thin, late-night traffic heading downtown. The rain hit the windshield in steady sheets. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had once worked well together and had not forgotten how. Then Jack said, without looking away from the road, "I should tell you something. I didn't end up here by accident tonight." Emily turned to look at him. "I assumed. I've been building something," he said. "A startup. Fintech. Small right now. But the foundation is solid. I've been working on it for about 2 years. He kept his eyes on the road. "I always thought if I was ever going to do this right, I needed someone who understood both sides, the legal architecture and the product strategy. Someone who could see a contract and tell you in the same breath what it means for the business 3 years from now." He glanced at her briefly. "I've only ever worked with one person who could do that." Emily said nothing for a moment. Outside, the city moved past in streaks of light and water. "You've been waiting," she said. It was not quite a question. "Not waiting," Jack said. "Building. But yes, I hoped eventually you'd be available." It was a careful answer. Honest, without being presumptuous. Emily recognized the precision in it, the same precision she had noticed years ago in a conference room when he had flagged a liability clause that 2 senior partners had missed. Jack Miller did not say things carelessly. He never had. She looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets and thought about Daniel's voice through the half-open door. She thought about the divorce papers on the table. She thought about the empty feeling she had expected to find on the other side of that decision and how it had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something quieter and more durable, the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be doing exactly what you should have done a long time ago. "Tell me about the startup," Emily said. Jack allowed himself a small, controlled smile. He kept driving, and he started to talk, and by the time they reached the bridge, the rain had begun to ease, and Emily Carter was listening with the full, focused attention she had spent 9 years giving to someone else's company. Emily found an apartment in Boston within a week. It was small, 1-bedroom, 3rd floor, a window that looked out onto a narrow street rather than a skyline. The monthly rent was a fraction of what Daniel spent on a single dinner reservation. She paid the deposit herself from an account she had maintained separately for years, without ever examining why, and she stood in the empty living room on the first morning with her 1 suitcase and her laptop bag, and understood that this was, in fact, enough. She had expected the silence to feel like loss. It did not. It felt like something she had been holding her breath against for a very long time, and she was finally allowed to exhale. The press did not take long to find the story. By the end of the first week, 2 financial gossip columns had run items about the Carter divorce, careful speculative pieces that referred to irreconcilable differences, and a source close to the family. By the second week, one of the larger tabloid sites had published a photograph of Emily leaving a coffee shop in Boston suitcase, visible in the background, under a headline that read, "Billionaire's wife walks out. But where is she going?" The implication of the headline was clear. It was not asking about her destination. It was asking whether she had one. Emily read the article once, closed the tab, and went back to work. Jack's startup was called Ava, a name he had chosen, he told her, because it meant nothing to anyone yet, which meant it could come to mean exactly what they built it to be. The concept was precise, a compliance and contract intelligence platform designed specifically for mid-market fintech companies, the category of business that was too large for generic legal software, but too lean to maintain full in-house counsel. It was Emily recognized immediately the exact gap she had been quietly filling by hand for 9 years inside Nexum Financial. The entire market for this product existed because companies like Daniel's depended on people like her and had never been forced to acknowledge it. She came on as co-founder with a focus on legal architecture and product strategy. She worked from her apartment in the mornings and from Eva's small office space in Cambridge 3 days a week. The work was different from anything she had done inside a marriage, not because it was harder, but because every decision she made was hers. Every clause she drafted, every structural choice she embedded into the platform's framework. Every strategic call she weighed in on carried her name, not as a footnote, as an author. There were hard weeks. She did not pretend otherwise, even to herself. The divorce proceedings moved at the pace that legal proceedings always move, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paperwork, that Emily was at minimum professionally equipped to navigate. Her reputation in New York's upper-tier legal circles had taken the specific kind of damage that had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with proximity. She had been Daniel Carter's wife, and now she was his ex-wife in progress, and in certain rooms that distinction mattered more than her record. She lost 2 potential consulting clients in the first month, both of whom gave her polished, non-committal explanations that she recognized immediately as the professional version of not wanting to be adjacent to a public divorce. She accepted this without argument. She noted it, filed it away, and moved forward. Daniel, meanwhile, was not worried. The people around him said so in the same gossip columns that had photographed Emily leaving a coffee shop. He had been seen at an industry dinner in Midtown, relaxed and apparently unbothered, telling a table of investors that the separation was amicable and that Nexum was in a strong position heading into the fourth quarter. He looked by every visible measure like a man who had absorbed a disruption and continued operating without a change in altitude. He had told his friends she would never leave. Now that she had, he had simply revised the timeline. She would come back, or she wouldn't, and it wouldn't matter because he had built the company, and he knew how it ran, and he did not need anyone's help to keep it standing. That belief was about to cost him significantly. The first sign appeared 6 weeks after Emily left. A contract renewal with one of Nexum's 3 largest institutional partners came up for renegotiation, and the in-house legal team, competent, well-paid, and entirely accustomed to having Emily review anything above a certain threshold, produced a draft that contained a liability allocation clause that was simply wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Wrong in the quiet technical way that does not announce itself until 18 months later, when a dispute arises and the clause that should have protected the company instead creates an opening for the other side. No one caught it. The contract was signed. The second sign came 2 weeks after that, when a regulatory filing that Emily had historically prepared went out with an inconsistency in its risk disclosure language. It was the kind of inconsistency that regulators noticed. Not immediately, but they noticed. The problem was structural rather than personal. Emily had not simply done legal work. She had been the institutional memory of how the company protected itself, which clauses needed watching, which relationships needed maintaining, which filings had history behind them that the documents alone did not explain. That knowledge had lived in her, and she had walked out the door with it. Back in Cambridge, Jack spread a set of financial projections across the table in the AEVA office one afternoon in late November and walked Emily through the investor pipeline he had been building. The company had 3 serious conversations in progress with venture capital firms, 2 in Boston and 1 in New York. The New York firm was the most significant, a mid-sized fund with a strong fintech portfolio and a managing partner named Greg Calloway, who had a reputation for backing founders with deep domain expertise rather than standard pedigree. "Calloway wants to see us in person," Jack said, setting down the projections. "There's a gala in Manhattan next month, annual financial technology summit, about 400 attendees, serious capital in the room. He'll be there. He suggested we come." Emily looked at the projections and then at Jack. "Manhattan," she said. "I know," Jack said. He did not over-explain it. He understood what the word meant to her. Practically, Manhattan meant the same industry circles she had navigated for 9 years as Daniel Carter's wife. It meant the same rooms, some of the same faces, and the very real possibility of the same cameras that had photographed her outside a coffee shop with a suitcase. "It also means," Jack continued, "that we walk in as Ava, not as anyone's anything else, just the company." Emily looked at the name on the top of the projection documents. Ava. Co-founders, Jack Miller, Emily Carter. Her name, her title, her work. It had been there for weeks, and she had seen it every day. But something about seeing it in the context of this specific conversation, going back to Manhattan, going back into those rooms, going back as herself, rather than as an extension of someone else, made it land differently. "Set up the meeting," she said. Jack nodded and reached for his phone. He did not make a production of the moment, which was one of the things Emily had come to recognize as central to how he operated. Jack Miller did not perform significance. He identified what mattered. He said it clearly, and then he moved to the next thing. It was, she had realized over the past several weeks, exactly the quality she had been providing to someone else's organization for 9 years, without anyone naming it as valuable. They spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the gala, with the same focused, unhurried intensity they had brought to every other stage of building Ava. Emily drafted the legal and compliance framework documents that would accompany the investor presentation clean, precise, and structured in a way that made the platform's value proposition immediately legible to anyone who understood the regulatory environment fintech companies operated in. Jack built the product demo and handled the technical architecture documentation. Together, they constructed a pitch that did not oversell or perform. It simply showed clearly and completely what the company was and what it could become. On the evening before they were scheduled to fly to New York, Jack found Emily still at her desk at 9 in the evening, reading through the presentation one final time. He set a cup of coffee on the desk beside her without being asked. "You know it's ready," he said. Emily looked up. "I know," she said. "I'm not checking for errors. I'm just reading it." Jack pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. He understood what she meant. She was reading her own work the way you read something you wrote a long time ago and are seeing clearly for the first time, not to correct it, but to confirm it, to let it be real. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said without looking up from the document. "Yes," Jack said. "You said you'd been building this for 2 years, that you thought about me as a co-founder." She set the document down. "How did you know I'd leave?" Jack considered the question honestly the way he always considered things before answering. "I didn't know," he said. "I hoped. I thought eventually, a person who's that good at what they do can't keep doing it for someone who doesn't see it. It becomes its own kind of unsustainable." He looked at her steadily. "I just thought I'd be ready when it happened." Emily held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the document again. "Good answer," she said. They flew to New York the following morning. The city looked the same from the air, dense and lit, and indifferent to the particular weight of anyone's return. Emily looked at it through the airplane window without sentiment. She was not going back. She was arriving somewhere new that happened to occupy the same geography. The distinction mattered. She held it clearly in her mind as the plane descended, and she did not let go of it. The gala was held in a ballroom on the 34th floor of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of room that had been designed to make everyone inside it feel like they had already arrived. Chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows the city spread out below, like an argument for ambition. 400 people informal. Where most of them moving through the room, with the practiced ease of people who attended events like this, often enough that they no longer had to think about how to move through them. Emily had been in rooms like this hundreds of times. She knew the rhythms who stood near the bar, who positioned themselves by the entrance, who circulated and who planted and waited for the right people to come to them. She had navigated all of it before, fluently for years. The difference was that every previous time she had entered a room like this, she had entered it as Daniel Carter's wife. Tonight she walked in beside Jack Miller, and her name on the event registration read, Emily Carter, co-founder Ava. It was a small difference in typography. It was not a small difference in anything else. Greg Calloway found them within the first 20 minutes, a compact man in his early 50s, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made enough good bets that he no longer needed to perform certainty. He shook Jack's hand, then Emily's, and when he said her name, there was a specificity to his attention that told her he had done his research before tonight. "I've been looking at your compliance framework documents," Calloway said, accepting a drink from a passing server without breaking eye contact. The liability allocation structure in your platform design that's not standard architecture. Whoever built that has seen the inside of a lot of contracts that went wrong. That would be Emily, Jack said simply. Calloway looked at her. Where did you develop that framework? Emily held his gaze. 9 years of fixing problems that weren't supposed to exist, she said. Calloway smiled, brief, genuine. That's the most useful kind of education. He gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. Walk me through the enterprise tier. I want to understand the scalability ceiling. They moved to the side of the room, and Emily began to talk, not performing, not pitching in the anxious, over-prepared way of someone who needed the yes. She talked the way she had always worked, directly with precision, showing the architecture of the thing rather than just the surface of it. Jack stood slightly behind and to her left, contributing when the conversation required his technical specificity, and the two of them moved through the material with the kind of easy fluency that only comes from having actually built something together. Calloway asked good questions. Emily answered every one of them. She did not see Daniel enter the room. She heard him first, that particular frequency of his voice that carried slightly above the surrounding noise, without him ever seeming to raise it, a quality she had once found compelling, and now simply recognized as a signal the way you recognize weather. She did not turn around immediately. She finished her answer to Calloway's last question, let the conversation reach a natural resting point, and then turned. Daniel was standing 20 feet away, and he had already seen her. He looked at first glance exactly the same, well-tailored, composed, the particular expression he wore in professional settings that communicated ease without warmth. But Emily had spent 9 years reading the specific sub-language of his composure, and she saw what was underneath it in the first 3 seconds. He was not relaxed. He was managing. There was a tightness around his jaw and a quality to his stillness that she recognized as the stillness of someone performing calm rather than feeling it. She understood in that moment that things at Nexum had gotten worse than anything that had appeared in the press. Daniel moved toward her with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who wanted to look like he had planned to cross the room in her direction all along. He nodded briefly at Jack. The nod men give each other when they are in a situation they have not yet categorized, and then his attention settled on Emily with the focused weight of someone who had been rehearsing what they were about to say. "You look well," Daniel said. "Daniel." Emily's voice was even. He glanced at Calloway, registered the name badge, registered what it meant, and looked back at Emily with an expression that recalibrated slightly. "Can we find somewhere to talk?" "For a few minutes?" Emily studied him. She had no anger for him. She had moved past that in the hallway outside their bedroom the night she had heard his voice through the half-open door. What she had for him now was clarity, which was a different thing entirely and considerably less comfortable for the person on the receiving end. "You can say it here," she said. Something moved across Daniel's face. Not quite embarrassment, not quite frustration, a recalculation. He was a man who was very accustomed to controlling the conditions of a conversation, and she had just declined to give him that. "The company needs help," he said, dropping his voice slightly. "The Hargrove contract renewal, there's a clause dispute heading toward arbitration. The fourth quarter regulatory filing has a language inconsistency that the SEC flagged last week. The in-house team is..." He stopped. "They're not you, Emily. And I think we both know that." Emily let him finish. Then she said, "I know." Daniel nodded, reading that as an opening. "If you came back even in a consulting capacity, even short-term, we could structure it however makes sense for you. Your terms." Emily looked at him for a moment. Around them, the gala continued voices movement, the sound of 400 people in a room where serious money was quietly changing direction. She thought about the Hargrove contract and knew without needing to see the document exactly which clause he was talking about. She had flagged that contract as a renewal risk in a memo 18 months ago. She had included a recommended revision. The memo had been acknowledged and then filed, and then apparently not acted upon. She thought about the regulatory filing. She thought about the data breach 3 years ago, and the acquisition negotiation before that, and the liability restructuring that had taken her 4 months to build, and that had saved Nexum an estimated $40 million in potential exposure. She thought about the evening she had sat in her office and heard Daniel tell his friends she would never leave because she needed the life. "I didn't break your company, Daniel," she said. "I just stopped holding it together." The distinction landed exactly as she intended it. She watched him absorb it, the specific, precise way it reframed every assumption he had been operating on. He had come to this room believing that if Emily had caused a problem, Emily could be persuaded to fix it. What she had just told him was that she had not caused anything. She had simply stopped doing something invisible that he had never noticed until it was gone. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jack. Then he looked at the Eva name badge on Emily's lapel. He was doing the math, and the math was not resolving in a direction he had anticipated. Jack stepped forward at that point, not aggressively, simply with the quiet solidity of someone who had been standing in his own space and was now making it legible. "Greg," he said, turning back to Calloway, "I'd like to finish walking you through the enterprise tier. Emily's built something that I think changes how mid-market compliance gets structured across the board." Calloway, who had been watching the exchange with the patient attention of a man who had learned to read rooms, nodded and turned back toward Emily with an expression that had, if anything, sharpened with interest. Daniel did not follow. He stood where he was as Emily turned away from him and back toward the conversation that was actually worth having, and she did not look back, not out of coldness, simply because there was nothing in that direction that required her attention anymore. The rest of the evening moved with a momentum that felt to Emily less like luck than like inevitability, the specific kind of inevitability that arrives after a very long period of preparation. Calloway introduced her to 2 other partners from his fund. One of them had read a paper she had written during her Columbia years on regulatory compliance structures in cross-border fintech transactions. He mentioned it by title. He mentioned the argument she had made in the 3rd section. He asked her a question about it that assumed she had continued to develop the thinking. She had. She answered him at length, and the answer was better than the paper had been. By 9 o'clock, Ava had 3 firm requests for follow-up meetings and 1 term sheet conversation scheduled for the following week. Calloway shook both their hands at the end of the evening, with the particular handshake of a man who has made a decision. "I'll have my team reach out Monday," he said to Jack, and then to Emily. "You should be the one in the room for the term sheet conversation." "I will be," Emily said. She and Jack took a car back to the hotel afterward, and the city moved past the windows in the same dense, indifferent way it always had. Jack did not say much, which was one of the things she had come to rely on his ability to let a significant moment be significant without narrating it. After a while, Emily said, "He still thought I'd come back." "I know," Jack said. "He thought the company falling apart would be the thing that brought me back." She looked out the window. "He still doesn't understand that I'm the reason it didn't fall apart sooner." Jack nodded. "He built his whole model on you staying," he said. "He never once built anything to account for you leaving." Emily thought about the dining table in the penthouse, the wedding ring she had set down next to the divorce papers, the specific silence of that apartment after she had closed the front door behind her, and the rain had started, and the gate had been in front of her, and the only thing ahead of her had been the question of what happened next. She knew the answer now. It was in the term sheet conversation scheduled for Monday. It was in the compliance framework documents she had built from the ground up over the past 3 months. It was in the Iva name on her badge, and in the way Greg Calloway had said, "You should be the one in the room, not as a concession, but as a recognition." Somewhere across the city, in a $20 million penthouse on the Upper East Side, there was a dining table with a wedding ring on it, Daniel Carter still had that. He had the ring, and the address, and the title on the door, and the company that was quietly coming apart at the seams in all the places she had once held it together. She had her name on a company she had helped build from nothing. She had a room full of investors who had looked at her work and seen what it actually was. She had the clean, undecorated satisfaction of a person who had stopped making someone else look capable and started simply being capable out loud, on the record under her own name. Some people believe you will never leave. They build their entire architecture around the certainty of your presence, around the assumption that you need what they provide, more than you need what you are. And for a long time, if you are not careful, that certainty can feel like the truth. But it is not the truth. It is just a story someone told confidently enough that you forgot to question it. She had not left in anger. She had not left in grief. She had left the moment she finally saw the situation for what it was, and understood that staying at that point would have been the only real loss.